Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I'll never forget the day my parents told me they had written me out of their will, and not because of some major falling out, betrayal, or life-altering event. No, it was over something so ridiculous it still feels like a fever dream. It all started when I missed a family dinner. That's it, just one dinner. I was working late, stuck finishing a big project at the office, and there was no way I could make it. I called to explain and apologize profusely, but that wasn't good enough. The next day, my mom called me. Her voice was ice cold. "If you can't prioritize family," she said, "maybe you don't deserve to be part of it." I was stunned. My family had always been a little dramatic. Sure, but this seemed over the top even for her. I tried to explain again. How I'd been swamped at work, how I didn't have a choice, but she wouldn't budge. She ended the call by saying, "You'll regret this, mark my words." At the time, I thought she was just blowing off steam. We'd had our arguments before, and they usually fizzled out after a few days. But this time was different. A week later, I got the call that changed everything. My dad called me, sounding more serious than usual. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your mom and I have decided to make some changes to the will," he said flatly. "We've removed your name. It'll all go to Sarah now. Maybe this will teach you to value family more." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Wait, what?" I said, laughing nervously. "You're joking, right?" "I'm not joking," he said. "You'll get a copy of the updated document soon." Sure enough, later that day, I got an email from him. Attached was a PDF of the new will. I scanned through it, feeling my heart sink with every word. My name was completely gone. Everything, every last penny, was now going to my younger sister, Sarah. Now, let me tell you a bit about Sarah. I love her, I do, but she's not exactly the most responsible person. She's the kind of person who spends her rent money on a last-minute trip to Cabo and then calls our parents crying for help when she gets back. She's had more jobs than I can count because she can't seem to show up on time or stay out of drama with her coworkers. And she's maxed out her credit cards more times than I can remember. When I saw her name in the will, my jaw practically hit the floor. It wasn't just unfair, it was reckless. "You're really putting all your faith in Sarah?" I asked my dad when I called him back. "Yes," he said firmly. "Maybe this will be a wake-up call for you. Family comes first. You're too focused on your job and your so-called independence. Maybe you'll understand what really matters now." I was furious. My parents had always been big on teaching lessons, but this was a step too far. I hung up the phone, shaking with anger. I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to call them back and yell. Part of me wanted to cry. But in the end, I decided I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing how much it hurt. Fine, I thought. If they wanted to gamble everything on Sarah, that was their choice. I wouldn't beg or grovel. I would focus on my own life and let them figure out the consequences. Little did I know, those consequences would come sooner than any of us expected. Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I buried myself in work, went out with friends, and told myself it didn't matter. After all, I'd always been self-sufficient. I didn't need their money. But the more I thought about it, the more it stung. It wasn't just about the will. It was about what it represented. My parents had essentially told me I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worthy of their legacy. I confided in my best friend, Maria, about the whole mess. "Can you believe them?" I said, pacing her living room. "I missed one dinner. One. And now they've just erased me from the family?" Maria shook her head. "That's insane," she said. "But honestly, you're better off without their strings attached. They're clearly playing favorites, and that never ends well." She was right, of course, but it was hard to let it go, especially knowing that Sarah, of all people, was now the sole beneficiary. I tried to picture her managing that kind of responsibility, and I couldn't. She was the kind of person who'd win the lottery and be broke again within a year. Still, I kept my distance. If my parents wanted to teach me a lesson, fine, I'd let them. But I had a sinking feeling that this lesson wasn't going to turn out the way they expected. And boy, was I right. It didn't take long for things to go sideways. My grandparents passed away about 6 months after I was written out of the will, and Sarah inherited a sizable amount of money from their estate. I wasn't surprised when my parents didn't include me in the inheritance. By that point, I had already accepted that I was the black sheep of the family. What did surprise me, though, was how quickly Sarah managed to burn through her windfall. At first, it was little things. Stuff you might expect someone to splurge on when they come into money. She bought a new car, a sleek convertible she definitely didn't need. Then came the designer clothes and accessories. Every time I saw her, she was carrying a new handbag or wearing something with a flashy label. Treating myself, she'd say with a grin. But it didn't stop there. Sarah started posting pictures on social media from exotic vacations, Bali, Paris, Dubai. It felt like every week, she was in a new time zone. I remember calling her one day to check in. "Hey, looks like you're living it up," I said, trying to sound casual. "Life's too short not to, right?" She replied breezily. "Sure," I said. "But, maybe set some of it aside? For the future?" Sarah laughed. "You sound just like Mom and Dad. Always so boring. Lighten up, will you?" That conversation stuck with me. I wasn't mad at her. I mean, it was her money, and she could do what she wanted with it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was setting herself up for disaster. I knew Sarah, and I knew she wasn't the type to think about consequences until they were staring her in the face. Meanwhile, I was grinding away at my job, trying to save every penny I could. I didn't have a trust fund or an inheritance to fall back on, so I had no choice but to plan for the long term. Honestly, I didn't resent Sarah. If anything, I felt a little sorry for her. She'd always been sheltered by our parents, never really forced to deal with the real world. I figured she'd learn her lessons the hard way, just like I did. But the real kicker came one evening when Sarah called me in tears. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I'm in so much trouble." My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for the worst. She launched into a rambling explanation about how she'd maxed out all her credit cards. "I didn't realize how fast it added up," she said, her voice shaking. "And now I'm behind on my car payments, and my landlord's threatening to evict me." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "Sarah, why didn't you call me sooner?" "I thought I could handle it," she said. "I thought it would get better, but it just kept getting worse." I felt bad for her. I really did. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think back to all the times she'd brushed off my advice, all the times she'd laughed at the idea of saving money or planning for the future. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. "I don't know what to tell you," I said finally. "You're going to have to figure this out." "I already talked to Mom and Dad," she admitted. "They're helping me, at least for now. But I think they're getting tired of it." That part didn't surprise me. My parents had always spoiled Sarah, but even they had their limits. "What exactly are they helping you with?" I asked. "Everything," she said, sniffling. "My credit cards, my rent, my car payments. But it's not enough. I need more." Hearing that was like watching a slow-motion car crash. I could already see where this was headed, and it wasn't anywhere good. Sarah wasn't just in a financial hole. She was digging herself deeper by the day. And worse, she was dragging my parents down with her. After I hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about the situation. How much money had my parents already given her? How long could they keep bailing her out before it started affecting them? I knew Sarah well enough to know this wasn't a one-time crisis. This was the result of years of bad habits and poor decisions catching up with her. I considered calling my parents to warn them, but I hesitated. Part of me thought, they made their bed. Let them lie in it. After all, they were the ones who put all their faith and their money into Sarah. If they couldn't see the writing on the wall, that wasn't my problem. But another part of me couldn't shake the nagging sense of responsibility. As much as I wanted to stay out of it, this was my family. And whether I liked it or not, I had a feeling their problems would eventually become my problems. Little did I know, that moment would come sooner than I expected. A few months passed, and I was starting to find some peace in the distance I had put between myself and my family. Work was going well. I had just been promoted, and for once, I felt like I was in control of my own life. That was until I received a call from my mother on a dreary Thursday evening. The moment I heard her voice, I could tell something was off. She sounded strained, her usual composed tone replaced with an undercurrent of anxiety. "Can you come over tomorrow evening? We need to talk," she said. I hesitated. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end. "We'll discuss it when you get here," she replied, evading my question. Curiosity mingled with a sense of dread as I agreed. The next day, I drove to my parents' house, a place that used to feel like home but now seemed foreign. The familiar oak tree in the front yard, the neatly trimmed hedges, the white shutters, all reminders of a simpler time. When I walked in, the atmosphere was heavy. My parents were seated at the kitchen table, papers strewn about, mugs of untouched coffee growing cold. They looked older than I remembered, lines of worry etched deeply into their faces. "Sit down," my father said, gesturing to the chair across from them. I took a seat, my eyes scanning the clutter on the table. Bank statements, overdue notices, and what looked like credit card bills were scattered everywhere. My mother clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white. "We've been helping Sarah financially," my dad began, his voice unusually soft. "But it's gotten out of hand." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" My mother sighed deeply. "She came to us a few months ago, saying she was in a bit of debt. We thought it was a one-time thing, so we helped her out. But the debts kept piling up. She maxed out the inheritance from your grandparents and then some." I felt a mix of shock and a bitter sense of validation. "How much are we talking about?" My father glanced at the papers before him. "She owes upwards of $200,000. My jaw dropped. $200,000? How is that even possible? Between the car loans, the luxury vacations, and the shopping sprees, it added up quickly, my mother said, her eyes welling with tears. "We used a significant portion of our savings to help her, but it's not enough." I leaned back in my chair, processing the information. "So, what do you expect me to do about it?" My father cleared his throat. "We were hoping you could help us figure out a solution. Maybe talk to her? She listens to you." I let out a humorless laugh. "Listens to me? She hasn't taken a word of advice from me in years. Besides, when I tried to warn her before, she called me boring and brushed me off." "We know we've put you in a difficult position," my mother said softly, "but we're running out of options." I looked at them, the parents who had so readily dismissed me not long ago, the ones who had written me out of their lives over a missed dinner. Now, they were sitting across from me, asking for my help because the daughter they favored was sinking them all. Why should I get involved? I asked bluntly. "You made it clear where we stood when you changed the will." They exchanged guilty glances. "Perhaps we were too harsh," my father admitted. "We thought we were teaching you a lesson about the importance of family." "Well, consider the lesson learned," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "But maybe it's time Sarah learns a lesson of her own." My mother reached out and placed her hand over mine. "Please, she's your sister. We're worried about her." She's not handling things well," I sighed, feeling the weight of familial obligation pressing down on me. Despite everything, Sarah was still my sister. "Fine," I conceded. "I'll talk to her. But I can't promise anything." Relief washed over their faces. "Thank you," my mother whispered. That evening, I called Sarah. It took a few tries before she picked up. When she did, her voice was defensive. "What do you want?" "Can we meet up?" "We need to talk," I said. "About what?" "Just, can you meet me at the cafe on Maple Street tomorrow?" She sighed loudly. "Fine. Whatever." The next day, I arrived early, ordering a coffee and finding a quiet corner table. Sarah showed up 20 minutes late, sunglasses perched atop her head, designer purse slung over her shoulder. "Make it quick," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. I took a deep breath. "Mom and Dad told me what's going on. They're worried about you." She rolled her eyes. "Of course they are. Sarah, you've racked up a lot of debt. They're dipping into their savings to bail you out. This isn't sustainable." She scoffed. "Like you care. I'm here, aren't I?" She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Look, I don't need a lecture. I have everything under control. Do you? Because it doesn't seem that way." She glared at me. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Miss Goody Two-Shoes with your stable job and your savings account." "This isn't about me," I said calmly. "I'm trying to help you." "I don't need your help," she snapped. "And I certainly don't need your pity." I studied her face, noting the shadows under her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. "Sarah, what's really going on?" For a moment, her facade cracked. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears before she quickly looked away. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Forget it. This was a mistake." She stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. "Don't bother calling me again, Sarah." But she was already walking away, leaving me sitting there with more questions than answers. I returned to my parents' house that evening to relay what had happened. They listened quietly as I recounted the tense conversation. "She's in denial," I concluded. "I don't think talking is going to help at this point." My mother wrung her hands nervously. "What do we do?" "I think you need to stop giving her money," I said firmly. "As long as you keep bailing her out, she has no reason to change." "We can't just abandon her," my father protested. "You're not abandoning her. You're giving her a chance to take responsibility for her actions." They looked unconvinced. I could see the conflict in their eyes, the struggle between parental love and the harsh reality of the situation. "She might hate you for it," I added. "But enabling her isn't helping anyone." My mother wiped away a tear. We never imagined it would come to this. Neither did I admitted. There was a heavy silence before my father spoke again. There's something else. I raised an eyebrow. What now? He shifted uncomfortably. We're in a bit of financial trouble ourselves. I frowned. What do you mean? My mother looked down at her lap. We took out a second mortgage on the house to cover Sarah's debts. My heart sank. You did what? We thought it was temporary, my father said defensively. We thought she'd pay us back once she got back on her feet. I stared at them in disbelief. How much did you give her? They exchanged a guilty glance. Nearly all of it, my mother whispered. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process the information. So you're telling me you're at risk of losing the house because of this? My father nodded slowly. Unless we can find a way to cover the payments. I felt a surge of anger mixed with a pang of sympathy. They had put themselves in this position, but they were still my parents. Why didn't you come to me sooner? We were ashamed, my mother admitted. After everything that happened, we didn't think we had the right to ask for your help. I sighed heavily. What exactly are you asking me to do? My father met my gaze. We need a loan. Just enough to get us back on track. We'll pay you back with interest. I leaned back in my chair, contemplating their request. Part of me wanted to refuse, to tell them they had made their choices and now had to face the consequences. But another part of me couldn't ignore their desperation. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. They nodded, relief and uncertainty etched on their faces. Thank you, my mother whispered. As I drove home that night, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Could I afford to help them? Technically, yes. I had savings set aside for emergencies, but this wasn't my emergency. And what guarantee did I have that they wouldn't turn around and funnel more money to Sarah? When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring into the darkness. My phone buzzed, an incoming call from Maria. Hey, I answered wearily. How did it go? She asked. I filled her in on the latest developments. Wow, she said when I finished. That's a lot. Tell me about it. So what are you going to do? I have no idea, I admitted. Part of me wants to help them, but another part feels like I'd just be enabling the cycle. Listen, Maria said thoughtfully, you're not responsible for their choices. You've worked hard to build your life. It's not fair for them to expect you to jeopardize that because of their mistakes. I know, I said, rubbing my temples. But they're my family. Family or not, you have to set boundaries. Maybe there's a way to help them without putting yourself at risk. Like what? Maybe offer to help them create a budget or find a financial advisor. But lending them money might not be the best idea. I mulled over her words. You might be right. Of course I am, she said lightly. I always am. I chuckled softly. Thanks, Maria. I needed that. Anytime. And remember, whatever you decide, make sure it's the right choice for you. After we hung up, I felt a bit more clarity. I decided I would meet with my parents again, but this time, I would set some conditions. The following day, I returned to their house. They greeted me anxiously, hopeful eyes watching my every move. I've thought about your request, I began. I'm willing to help, but there are conditions. They nodded eagerly. Anything, my father said. First, we need to have an honest conversation about your finances. I want to see all the numbers, debts, expenses, everything. They looked hesitant but agreed. Second, you need to cut off any additional financial support to Sarah. No more bailouts. My mother opened her mouth to protest but then closed it, resigning herself to the necessity. Third, we need to create a plan to get you back on track. That might include downsizing or making other lifestyle changes. They glanced at each other before my father spoke. We understand. Lastly, any money I provide will be a loan, with a formal agreement outlining repayment terms. They both nodded, relief evident on their faces. Thank you, my mother said, tears welling up. We don't deserve your kindness. I offered a small smile. Let's just focus on moving forward. Over the next few hours, we went through their finances in painstaking detail. It was worse than I had anticipated. They had accumulated significant debt beyond the second mortgage, partly due to covering Sarah's extravagant expenses. We really messed up, my father admitted quietly. What's done is done, I said. The important thing is that we're addressing it now. As we worked on a plan, a sense of cautious optimism began to emerge. It wouldn't be easy, but with discipline and some tough choices, they could regain stability. Just as we were wrapping up, there was a loud knock at the door. My mother went to answer it, and moments later, Sarah stormed into the room. What's this I hear about you cutting me off? She demanded, glaring at our parents. My father stood up. Sarah, we need to talk. You're damn right we do, she yelled. How could you do this to me? Calm down, I interjected. This isn't the time or place. She whirled around to face me. Oh, I see what's happening. You're poisoning them against me. That's not what's happening, I said evenly. We're trying to help everyone, including you. I don't need your help, she spat. I need my parents to stop betraying me. Betraying you, my mother echoed, aghast. We've given you everything, and now you're abandoning me when I need you the most, Sarah retorted. My father took a deep breath. Sarah, we can't keep enabling your behavior. It's hurting you and it's hurting us. She shook her head furiously. I can't believe this. You're all against me. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. A heavy silence filled the room. My mother sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. What have we done? She whispered. I placed a hand on her shoulder. She needs time. Hopefully, she'll come around. Deep down, I wasn't so sure. But for now, we had to focus on what we could control. As I left that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. The fallout from years of denial and misplaced priorities was unraveling, and we were all caught in the storm. But at least now, we were facing it together. It was a cold, gray morning when my parents invited me over for yet another discussion. I had barely sat down before my father dropped the bombshell. We've been thinking, he began, his tone hesitant, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to lend Sarah some money to pay off her debts. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. Finally, I let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're joking, right? You cut me out of the will, literally erased me, and now you want me to bail her out. My mother's face flushed with guilt, but my father held his ground. Look, we know we made mistakes, but you're in a good position now. You're doing well for yourself, and we know you can afford to help. His words hit a nerve. Yes, I was doing well, but that wasn't because of any help from them. It was because I had worked my ass off for years, often without their support. Meanwhile, Sarah had been handed everything on a silver platter, and now they wanted me to clean up the mess she'd made with their blessing. You can't be serious, I said, shaking my head. You're asking me to reward her irresponsibility? To reward the decisions you made to put her on a pedestal? My father sighed, and for the first time, he looked genuinely weary. We're not asking for much, he said, just enough to cover the most pressing debts. We'll pay you back if it comes to that. I raised an eyebrow. If it comes to that? You know what he means, my mother interjected softly. We're just trying to keep this family together. Their words rang hollow. It was hard to see this as anything other than a desperate attempt to salvage the situation they had created. Still, part of me felt a pang of guilt. These were my parents, after all, and despite everything, Sarah was my sister. I'll think about it, I said finally, standing up, but honestly, I already knew my answer. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. The nerve they had to come to me after everything that had happened. It was almost laughable, and yet, the guilt lingered. Was I being too harsh? Could I really turn my back on my family, even if they had turned their backs on me? I decided to call Sarah to get her side of the story. It took her a while to pick up, and when she finally did, she sounded defensive right off the bat. What now? She said, as if I had been pestering her. I just wanted to hear it from you, I replied. Mom and Dad said you're in a lot of debt. What's going on? There was a long pause before she spoke again. Yeah, I've been struggling, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I made some bad choices, but I'm trying to fix it. I really am. Her tone was uncharacteristically vulnerable, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. How bad is it? I asked. Bad, she admitted. But if you could help me out just this once, I'll pay you back. I swear. I'll get my act together. I couldn't help but feel skeptical. Sarah had made promises like this before, to my parents, to friends, even to herself. And every time, she had fallen back into the same patterns. Lending her money felt like throwing it into a black hole. I don't know, Sarah, I said finally. This isn't just about you. Mom and Dad are in trouble because of all the money they've already given you. I didn't ask them to do that, she snapped. Didn't you, though? I countered. You didn't ask, but you knew they'd do it. You've been taking advantage of their guilt for years. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, Look, I get it. I screwed up, but I'm trying to change. If you won't help me, just say so. Her words stung, even though I knew she was trying to manipulate me. I'll think about it, I said, echoing the words I'd given our parents. The next few days were a blur of overthinking and self-doubt. I confided in Maria, who didn't mince words. Don't do it, she said flatly. She's not your responsibility. They're my family, I argued. And where were they when you needed support? She countered. They didn't think twice about cutting you out of their lives. Now they're coming to you because they know you'll fix things for them. Maria's words hit home, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I spent hours weighing my options, trying to decide where the line between compassion and enabling lay. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let my parents and Sarah face the consequences of their actions. But another part of me couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I'd regret doing nothing. Finally, I decided I needed more information before making a decision. I called my parents and asked to meet again, this time with all the numbers laid out. I need to see exactly how much money we're talking about, I said. No more vague figures. I want a full breakdown of Sarah's debts and how much you've already spent. They reluctantly agreed, and a few days later, I found myself back at their kitchen table. This time, they had all the paperwork ready. As I went through the numbers, my jaw dropped. Sarah's debts were even worse than I had imagined, and my parents had nearly drained their retirement savings trying to bail her out. You can't keep doing this, I said, my voice firm. This isn't sustainable. We know, my mother said quietly. That's why we're asking for your help. I took a deep breath, considering my words carefully. If I agree to help, it's going to be on my terms, I said finally. My father frowned. What do you mean? I mean that this isn't going to be a handout. If I lend Sarah money, it's going to come with conditions. A formal agreement, interest, repayment terms, the works. And you both need to promise me that you won't give her another dime after this. My parents exchanged a worried glance, but they nodded. We'll do whatever it takes, my father said. I'll need some time to think about the exact terms, I said. But if Sarah agrees to them, I'll consider helping. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best I could offer. Whether Sarah would go along with it remained to be seen. After days of sleepless nights and countless internal debates, I finally made a decision. I would help, but only under strict conditions. This wasn't going to be an open-ended bailout or an emotional act of blind generosity. If my family wanted my help, they would have to play by my rules. I called my parents and Sarah to meet me at their house. When they all arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. My parents looked anxious, Sarah looked defiant, and I felt a strange combination of nervousness and resolve. I wasn't sure how they would react, but I knew I had to stand my ground. Here's the deal, I began, sitting down at the kitchen table. I'm willing to help Sarah pay off her debts, but this isn't going to be a gift. It's a loan. There will be a formal contract, interest, and a repayment schedule. If you can't agree to those terms, I'm out. My dad leaned back in his chair, frowning deeply. My mom's jaw dropped slightly, her face a mix of shock and hurt. And Sarah? Sarah stared at me like I just slapped her across the face. Are you serious? She finally said, her voice shaking. I'm completely serious, I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. This is the only way I'm willing to do this. But I'm your sister, she exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes. I know that, I said, meeting her gaze. And that's why I'm even considering helping you in the first place. But if I'm going to stick my neck out for you, I need to protect myself. This isn't how families should treat each other. My mom interjected, her voice trembling with emotion. We're supposed to help one another unconditionally. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to remind her of how unconditional their support for me had been when they wrote me out of the will. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, I get that this feels harsh, but I'm not doing this to punish anyone. I'm doing it to make sure this doesn't happen again. Sarah needs to learn how to manage her finances, and this is the only way I can make sure she takes it seriously. My dad rubbed his temples and sighed. It's not ideal, but I guess it's fair, he said reluctantly. My mom looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't say anything. Sarah, on the other hand, was full-on crying now. I can't believe you're doing this to me, she sobbed. I felt a pang of guilt, but I reminded myself that this wasn't about being liked. It was about making sure this situation didn't spiral even further out of control. You're free to say no, I said gently. But if you want my help, these are the terms. Over the next few days, I consulted a lawyer to draft up the agreement. It wasn't overly complicated, but it laid out everything clearly. The loan amount, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, and the consequences of failing to meet the terms. When the document was ready, I called another meeting. This time, everyone seemed more subdued. Sarah looked pale and exhausted, and my parents seemed wary but resigned. I've had a lawyer draft up the agreement, I said, handing a copy to Sarah. Take your time reading it, and let me know if you have any questions. She scanned the document, her expression growing darker with each passing second. You really don't trust me, do you? She muttered. This isn't about trust, I replied. It's about accountability. I need to know that you're taking this seriously. My dad leaned over to look at the document. The terms seem reasonable, he said after a moment. This is probably for the best, Sarah. Sarah shot him a glare but didn't say anything. After a long, tense silence, she finally picked up a pen and signed the agreement. There, she said bitterly, pushing the paper back toward me. Happy now? I ignored her tone and took the document, placing it carefully in a folder. Thank you, I said. I'll transfer the money to your account tomorrow. True to my word, I transferred the funds the next morning. It was a substantial amount, enough to cover Sarah's most pressing debts and give her a little breathing room. I hoped that this would be the wake-up call she needed to get her act together. At first, things seemed promising. Sarah started making changes, at least on the surface. She cut back on her spending, picked up a part-time job, and even started talking about taking a personal finance course. My parents were cautiously optimistic, and I allowed myself to feel a small flicker of hope. But deep down, I wasn't entirely convinced. I knew Sarah too well. She had a history of making big promises and then falling back into old habits once the pressure was off. And unfortunately, my instincts were about to be proven right. It started subtly. Sarah missed her first repayment by a few days. She called me with an excuse about a mix-up with her bank, and I let it slide. But then she missed the next payment entirely. When I called to ask what was going on, she sounded irritated. I'm dealing with a lot right now, she said. Can you cut me some slack? Sarah, we agreed to these terms for a reason, I reminded her. I know, she said hastily. I'll get back on track next month. I promise. I wanted to believe her, but a sinking feeling told me this was only the beginning of another downward spiral. As the weeks went on, it became clear that Sarah hadn't truly changed. She started missing more payments, making excuses, and dodging my calls. When I finally managed to confront her, she exploded. Why are you being so rigid about this? She yelled. You're acting like some kind of lone shark. I'm acting like someone who took a huge risk to help you, I shot back. And now you're proving that you can't be trusted. Our argument ended with her storming out and slamming the door behind her. My parents tried to mediate, but their attempts only made things worse. My mom begged me to be more patient, while my dad suggested I renegotiate the terms to make things easier for Sarah. This is exactly why we're in this mess, I said, frustration bubbling over. You've been enabling her for years, and now you're asking me to do the same. I won't do it. For the first time, I felt a deep sense of regret about my decision to help. I had hoped that setting firm boundaries would force Sarah to take responsibility for her actions. But instead, it seemed like nothing had really changed. As I left my parents' house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. For the first few months after I lent Sarah the money, things actually seemed to be improving. She got a part-time job at a boutique downtown, which felt like a small miracle given her track record. She even started paying me back. Small amounts, but consistently, enough to give me hope that maybe she was finally taking things seriously. My parents, who had been walking on eggshells since the whole arrangement began, seemed relieved. My mom even started calling me more often, which was unusual for her. Our conversations were light and friendly, almost like she was trying to rebuild the connection we had lost. My dad wasn't quite as open, but he made a point to check in every now and then, asking how work was going or if I needed anything. It was strange, almost surreal, to have them suddenly acting like we were close again. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little vindicated. After everything that had happened, their favoritism, the will, the fallout, it felt like they were finally starting to see me as the steady one, the reliable one. But I tried not to dwell on it too much. I didn't want to get my hopes up, only to have the rug pulled out from under me again. Then, almost predictably, things started to unravel. Sarah missed her first payment about 4 months in. At first, she blamed it on a mix-up with her bank. I let it slide, even though the excuse felt flimsy. But then she missed another payment, and another. When I finally called her to ask what was going on, she sounded irritated. It's just been a rough month, she said dismissively. Sarah, you've missed 3 payments in a row, I pointed out. This isn't just about 1 month. I said I'll pay you back, she snapped. Why are you being so harsh about this? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I'm not being harsh. I'm holding you to the agreement you signed. This is exactly why we set those terms in the first place. She let out a dramatic sigh. You're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm your sister, for God's sake. That's exactly why I helped you, I replied, my patience wearing thin. But I can't just ignore it when you're not holding up your end of the deal. The conversation went downhill from there. By the time we hung up, I was shaking with frustration. Things only got worse when my parents tried to intervene. My mom called me a few days later, her voice laced with worry. I think you need to go easier on Sarah, she said. Go easier on her? I repeated, incredulous. Mom, she hasn't made a single payment in months. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking her to honor the agreement she signed. I know, she said hesitantly, but she's under so much pressure right now. You have to understand how hard this has been for her. Hard for her? I snapped. What about how hard it's been for me? I put my own finances at risk to help her, and now I'm the bad guy because I expect her to take responsibility? My mom fell silent, and I could tell she didn't know how to respond. My dad called me later that evening, trying to play the voice of reason. Look, I know you're upset, he said, but maybe you could renegotiate the terms. Make it easier for her to catch up. Dad, that's exactly the problem, I said, my voice rising. You've spent her entire life bending over backward to make things easier for her. That's why we're in this mess in the first place. To his credit, he didn't argue, but I could hear the discomfort in his silence. The real breaking point came a week later, when Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced. She was visibly upset, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Can we talk? She said, her voice trembling. I let her in, bracing myself for whatever drama she was about to unload. She sat down on my couch and immediately launched into a tirade about how unfair I was being. I can't believe you're treating me like this, she said, tears streaming down her face. You've always been the favorite, and now you're using that to lord it over me. I stared at her, completely floored. The favorite? I repeated, struggling to keep my voice steady. Sarah, you were literally handed everything on a silver platter. I had to fight for every scrap of approval I got from Mom and Dad, and you're sitting here accusing me of favoritism? You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. You've always had your life together. You've always been the one who didn't need help. But me? I'm the screw-up. I'm the one they're always disappointed in. And now you're just proving them right. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I had watched my parents coddle her, clean up her messes, and give her chance after chance while I was left to fend for myself. And now she was trying to rewrite history, painting herself as the victim and me as the golden child. I'm not going to argue with you about this, I said finally, my voice cold. You signed an agreement. You're not holding up your end of it, and that's on you. Not me. She glared at me, her face a mask of anger and betrayal. You're just like them, she spat, pretending to care. But really, you just want to control me? Before I could respond, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Sarah had been the golden child, the one my parents put all their faith in. And now, because I was holding her accountable, she was accusing me of favoritism. It was almost funny in a tragic sort of way. I wanted to feel angry, but mostly, I just felt exhausted. I had done everything I could to help her, and it still wasn't enough. No matter what I did, it always seemed to end the same way, with Sarah blaming everyone but herself for her problems. As I sat there, staring out the window at the city lights, I realized something important. I couldn't keep pouring my energy into fixing Sarah's life. It wasn't my responsibility, and it never should have been. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Something had to change. One Friday night, just as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from a mutual friend of Sarah's, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. The message was brief, but it included a photo that made my stomach drop. Thought you'd want to see this, the text read. The photo showed Sarah at an upscale restaurant downtown, laughing with a glass of wine in hand. The table was crowded with plates of food that looked like they belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant. And in the background, I spotted a shopping bag from a luxury brand store, one I knew cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. I felt my blood pressure spike. I had been bending over backward to help Sarah, listening to her tearful excuses, extending deadlines on her loan payments, and shielding her from our parents' growing frustration. And here she was, living it up like she didn't have a care in the world. At first, I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe the dinner was a gift. Maybe the shopping bag wasn't hers. But as I scrolled through Sarah's social media, the truth became impossible to ignore. There were photos of her with a new pair of designer shoes, a cryptic caption about retail therapy, and a selfie from the restaurant with the tag #selfcare. I couldn't keep quiet. I called Sarah immediately, my hands shaking with anger. She picked up on the third ring, sounding annoyed. "What's up? Are you kidding me?" I snapped. "You've been crying to me about how broke you are, missing payments and asking for extensions. Meanwhile, you're out at fancy restaurants and blowing money on shopping sprees?" There was a long pause before she sighed dramatically. "I needed a break," she said. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "The pressure you're under?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What about the pressure I'm under? I stuck my neck out to help you, and this is how you repay me? By lying to my face?" "I wasn't lying," she protested. "I really am struggling. But sometimes you just need to do something for yourself, you know?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No, Sarah, I don't know. Because when I'm struggling, I don't spend money I don't have on shoes and fancy dinners." I cut back. "I make sacrifices. Maybe you should try it sometime." Her tone turned icy. "You don't get it. You've always had everything together. You've never had to deal with the kind of stress I do. That was the last straw." "You're unbelievable," I said. "I've been bending over backward to help you, and you're sitting here trying to play the victim. You know what? I'm done. Don't call me again unless it's to pay me back." Before she could respond, I hung up. My hands were still shaking as I set the phone down, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and disappointment. The next day, my parents called me, their voices filled with concern. "Sarah called us last night," my mom said. She was crying. "What happened?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, she didn't tell you? She's been blowing money on luxuries while claiming she's too broke to pay me back. I called her out on it, and now she's playing the victim." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before my dad spoke. "She told us she felt like you were being too hard on her." "Too hard on her?" I repeated. "Are you kidding me? I've given her nothing but chances, and she's thrown them all away. If you want to keep enabling her, that's your choice. But I'm done." "Don't say that," my mom pleaded. "She's your sister." "Yeah, she is," I said. "And I've done more for her than anyone else in this family. But I'm not going to let her drag me down with her. She's your problem now." It felt harsh, but I knew it was the truth. The fallout from that conversation was immediate. Sarah stopped talking to me entirely, which was honestly a relief. My parents, however, were another story. They called me almost daily, trying to get me to reconcile with Sarah. "She's trying her best," my mom would say. Or, "She just needs more support." But I refused to budge. "I've done enough," I told them every time. "If you want to keep bailing her out, go ahead. But don't ask me to be a part of it." Over the next few weeks, I started to hear whispers of Sarah's behavior from other family members and mutual friends. Apparently, she had been bragging about how stressful her life was while showing off her new purchases. It was infuriating, but it also made me feel vindicated. For years, I had been the one accused of not valuing family, of not being supportive enough. Now, everyone could see the truth for themselves. Despite everything, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of Sarah's problems on my shoulders. It was freeing, even if it came at the cost of my relationship with her. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the end. Sarah had a way of bouncing back into people's lives when they least expected it, and I had a sinking suspicion that she wasn't done with me yet. It was a Sunday afternoon when I got the call. My mom's voice came through the line, frantic and shaky. "We need to talk." "It's about Sarah," she said, barely able to hold back her tears. I sighed, already bracing myself for the next chapter in this endless saga. "What's going on now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Your father and we're in trouble," she said hesitantly. "It's worse than we thought. Sarah's debt has gotten out of control, and now we're at risk of losing the house." That got my attention. "What do you mean, losing the house? How is that even possible?" "She convinced us to co-sign another loan," my mom admitted, her voice breaking. "We thought it would help her get back on her feet, but now she's missed payments, and the bank is threatening foreclosure." I felt my stomach churn. "Wait, another loan? After everything that's happened?" "We didn't know what else to do," she said desperately. She was so upset. She begged us for help, and we thought this time would be different. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to calm myself. "Mom, I don't know how many times I have to say this. Sarah isn't going to change as long as you keep rescuing her. She knows you'll always bail her out, and she's using that to avoid taking responsibility. But she's our daughter," my mom said, her voice cracking. "We can't just abandon her." No one's saying you should abandon her, I replied. But you need to stop enabling her. If you don't, this cycle will never end. The conversation with my mom left me feeling a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and, oddly enough, vindication. For years, my parents had been over backward for Sarah, believing she could do no wrong. Now, they were facing the consequences of their blind faith. A few hours later, my dad called me. His tone was more subdued than usual, almost defeated. "I think we made a mistake," he said quietly. "You think?" I replied, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "We should have treated you better," he continued, ignoring my sarcasm. "We were so focused on helping Sarah that we didn't see what we were doing to you." Hearing those words should have felt like a victory, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. For years, I had been the afterthought, the one who didn't need help because I could handle things on my own. And now, when everything was falling apart, they were finally acknowledging their mistake. "It's a little late for that," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "I know," he admitted, "and I don't blame you if you're angry. But we don't know what to do anymore. We're scared, and we don't know how to fix this." The next day, I went over to their house to talk things through. When I arrived, the atmosphere was grim. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a tissue, while my dad stared blankly at a stack of paperwork. The sight of them, exhausted, defeated, made my anger soften, just a little. "Okay," I said, sitting down across from them. "Let's start with the facts. How much debt are we talking about?" My dad handed me a sheet of paper with a list of numbers that made my jaw drop. Between the loans they had co-signed, the money they had already given Sarah, and their own mounting bills, the total was staggering. "This is bad," I said, struggling to find the right words. "We know," my mom whispered. "We've already spoken to the bank, but they're not willing to negotiate unless we can make a substantial payment." I glanced at the numbers again, doing the math in my head. Even if I drained my savings, it wouldn't be enough to cover everything. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to sacrifice my financial stability for a mess I hadn't created. "You need to cut Sarah off," I said firmly. "No more loans, no more co-signing, no more money. She needs to deal with the consequences of her actions." "But what will happen to her?" my mom asked, her voice trembling. "She'll figure it out," I said. "She's an adult, Mom. She needs to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet." My dad nodded slowly. "You're right. We should have done this a long time ago." Over the next few hours, we went through their finances in painstaking detail, looking for ways to stop the bleeding. It wasn't easy, but we came up with a plan to stabilize their situation. It involved cutting back on expenses, selling some assets, and negotiating with creditors. "We're going to have to sell the house, aren't we?" my mom asked quietly. "It's a possibility," I said, "but it's not the end of the world. A smaller house could be more manageable, and it would give you some breathing room." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just can't believe it's come to this." "It's not too late to turn things around," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "But you have to commit to the plan. And that means no more bailing Sarah out." They both nodded, though I could see the guilt in their eyes. That evening, I left their house feeling emotionally drained. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about everything we had discussed. For the first time, my parents had admitted their mistakes, not just with Sarah, but with how they had treated me. It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, I felt validated. After years of being overlooked and dismissed, they were finally acknowledging my worth. But on the other hand, it didn't erase the pain of the past. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring out the window. The truth was, I wasn't sure if things could ever go back to the way they were. Too much had happened, and the damage felt irreparable. Still, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. My parents were finally starting to see the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The months that followed were, without a doubt, some of the most complicated of my life. After the debacle with Sarah's debt and the near loss of their house, my parents seemed to wake up to the reality they'd spent years avoiding. They began reaching out to me more often, not with the frantic desperation of before, but with what felt like genuine remorse. One evening, my mom called me out of the blue. "I know we've made mistakes," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. "We should never have written you out of the will. We thought we were teaching you a lesson, but all we did was push you away. We're sorry." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to say, too little, too late, but another part of me, the part that still craved my parents' approval, felt a pang of relief. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "It means a lot to hear you say that." It wasn't an instant fix. Forgiveness isn't something you can just snap your fingers and grant. But over time, their efforts started to feel more sincere. My dad began calling me just to chat about everyday things, work, the weather, even a show he thought I'd like. My mom made an effort to include me in family plans, even if they were small, like a Sunday lunch or a walk in the park. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel like they were trying to rebuild a connection that had been frayed for so long. I could tell it wasn't easy for them. Admitting they'd been wrong, especially after all the years they'd spent defending their choices, was clearly a humbling experience. Meanwhile, Sarah was spiraling. After years of being propped up by my parents, the sudden withdrawal of financial support hit her hard. At first, she tried to guilt them into reconsidering, calling with tearful pleas and promises to change. But this time, my parents stood firm. "We love you, Sarah," my mom told her during one particularly emotional call, "but we can't keep enabling you. You need to figure this out on your own." Sarah didn't take it well. She stopped calling my parents altogether and started venting on social media, painting herself as the victim of a family that had abandoned her. It was infuriating to watch, but I decided not to engage. Let her tell whatever story she wanted. The people who mattered knew the truth. Without my parents' support, Sarah's life took a predictable turn. She lost her apartment, her car was repossessed, and she bounced from one friend's couch to another. Instead of taking responsibility, she doubled down on blaming everyone but herself. "If mom and dad hadn't cut me off, I wouldn't be in this mess," she told anyone who would listen. It was hard to watch, even after everything that had happened. Despite her flaws, Sarah was still my sister, and seeing her self-destruct wasn't something I could take any pleasure in. But I knew there was nothing I could do to help her. She had to want to change, and until that happened, anything I did would just be enabling her behavior. The fallout from Sarah's financial disaster forced my parents to make some tough decisions of their own. After months of struggling to stay afloat, they finally admitted that they couldn't keep the house. It was a painful realization. They had lived there for over 30 years, and it was filled with memories of our childhood. But it was also the only way to regain some stability. They sold the house and moved into a smaller, more affordable place in a quiet neighborhood nearby. The move was bittersweet. On one hand, it marked the end of an era. On the other, it felt like a fresh start, a chance to let go of the past and focus on rebuilding. I helped them pack up the house, sorting through decades of belongings. There were moments of nostalgia, like finding old photo albums and childhood drawings. But there were also moments of awkwardness, like when we came across the copy of the will that had excluded me. "You can throw that away," my dad said quietly, his expression filled with regret. I nodded and tossed it into the trash, feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders. As my parents settled into their new home, I started to notice a shift in our relationship. They weren't just apologizing anymore. They were actively trying to show me that they valued me for who I was. My mom stopped making passive-aggressive comments about my workaholic tendencies, and my dad started asking for my advice on things like budgeting and financial planning. It was a strange feeling, being seen as the responsible one after years of being overshadowed by Sarah. For so long, I had felt like an afterthought, the independent child who didn't need attention or support. But now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly part of the family. One evening, as we sat in their new living room, my dad turned to me and said, "We're proud of you, you know? We don't say it enough, but we are." His words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Of course, things weren't perfect. The scars of the past didn't just disappear overnight. There were still moments of tension, moments when old wounds reopened. But for the most part, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. As for Sarah, I kept my distance. I hoped that one day she would turn things around, but I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix her. My parents seemed to understand that too. They still loved her, of course, but they had finally accepted that loving someone doesn't mean shielding them from the consequences of their actions. In a way, Sarah's downfall became a turning point for all of us. It forced my parents to confront their mistakes, and it gave me the opportunity to prove my worth, not to them, but to myself. For the first time in years, I felt like we were starting to heal. And while I wasn't sure if things would ever go back to the way they used to be, I was okay with that. Sometimes, moving forward is more important than looking back. Looking back, it's strange to think about how everything unfolded. When I first found out my parents had written me out of their will, I was furious, hurt in a way that's hard to put into words. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it symbolized. They had chosen Sarah, the golden child, the one who always needed rescuing, over me, the one they thought didn't need anything. But if I've learned anything from this whole experience, it's that life has a way of teaching lessons to everyone involved. My parents made mistakes, big ones, but I've come to realize that I made my own as well. Holding on to resentment, replaying old grievances, and keeping score only weighed me down. Forgiveness wasn't about letting them off the hook. It was about letting myself move forward. The road to that realization wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to slam the door shut on my family and never look back. But somewhere along the way, I realized that setting boundaries didn't mean shutting people out entirely. It meant finding a way to protect myself while still leaving room for growth, for connection, and, yes, even for love. Sarah, on the other hand, is still a question mark. She and I are distant now, not out of anger, but out of necessity. She's on her own path, and I've accepted that it's not my job to steer her in the right direction. Every now and then, I hear about her from mutual friends or family. She's still struggling, bouncing between jobs and living situations. Part of me hopes she'll figure it out one day, but I've let go of the responsibility I used to feel. Her journey is hers alone, and if she ever wants to make a real change, it has to come from her. There's a certain sadness in that distance, but there's also peace. I no longer feel the need to save her, to fix her, or to justify myself to her. That's a freedom I didn't know I needed. As for my parents, things are better now, different, but better. They've made a genuine effort to repair our relationship, and for the most part, it feels like we've turned a corner. They've even put me back in the will, though that feels more symbolic than anything else. After everything that's happened, the money doesn't matter to me anymore. What does matter is the way they've started to see me, not as the child who could handle anything on her own, but as someone who deserves care and attention too. It's a small but meaningful shift, and it's made all the difference. One evening, not long ago, my dad and I were sitting in his new living room, going through old family photos. He picked up one of me from my high school graduation and smiled. "You've always been so strong," he said. I laughed softly. "I didn't always feel that way." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm sorry for the times we didn't see that. You deserved better from us." His words caught me off guard, but they stayed with me long after I left that night. The real lesson in all of this? Sometimes, people have to hit rock bottom before they can see the light. That was true for Sarah, but it was also true for my parents, and maybe even for me. It's easy to point fingers, to blame others for their mistakes, and to hold on to the pain they've caused. But I've learned that real growth comes from looking in the mirror and asking, what can I do differently? How can I move forward? Sometimes, the best way to love someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions. That was a hard truth for my parents to learn, but in the end, it's what allowed them to start rebuilding their lives and our relationship. For me, the journey was about finding balance between forgiveness and self-preservation, between loving my family and setting boundaries, and between letting go of the past and embracing the future. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a real one. And honestly, that's enough for me.